Natural Order Podcast, Episode 15. Welcome to the Natural Order Podcast with your hosts, Brian O'Leary and Adam Haman. Natural Order Podcast, once again, Brian O'Leary here with Adam Haman.
Hello, Brian. How are you?
Hello. We're doing well. And today we had it in mind to talk a little bit about essentially the large-scale legalization or decriminalization of drugs, particularly in light of Oregon, it's been the first state in the union to really decriminalize or reclassify drug possession as just a minor violation, kind of taking the lead of Portugal, I guess. I mean, that's the model internationally, and we can get into that. But essentially, here, Adam, I want to talk about Oregon Ballot Measure 110. And so in the 2020 election, Ballot Measure 110 was passed, and it reclassified possession and penalties for specified drugs, which included heroin, methamphetamine, PCP, LSD, oxycodone, and others. The penalties for drug possession, as I said earlier, are now classified as a Class E civil violation. I'm not sure what that is, but basically no teeth to what you can get a violation, but there's no teeth to it. And the intent of the law, which I think might be perhaps bearing the lead, but we'll talk about it. It aims to reverse racial disparities in policing, and their projection, and perhaps the goal, was to reduce black arrests by 94% was the projection. So, where do you go with that?
Well,
just threw it out.
That's weird. It's weird for them to phrase it that way or sell it that way.
Yeah.
Do you happen to remember off the top of your head when they legalized and taxed the sale of marijuana?
It was a few years prior. I know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things about this measure, again, passed 3 years ago, is I'm sure when they were selling to the public, we are going to legalize weed and regulate it and tax it, that all the proceeds, the tax revenue, is going to go to fund all these city projects, primarily schools. That's usually how they sell it.
Uh-huh.
I don't know that for certain, but I bet that's how they sold it.
Well,
and it's interesting that
what ended up
one
happening
of the things
is that the dispensaries and the marijuana laws and all that stuff got put in with the Liquor Control Commission in Oregon. And I say this as a native Oregonian, no longer live there. It's sad to see what has happened, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, I just love the bait and switch you typically get from government. They sell it that we're going to get all this tax revenue for schools, or however they pitched it, roads, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then what this new measure did is cap how much of the revenue that's going to now go to schools, and instead divert all the remainder, I don't know how much that is, but I presume a lot, to fund all these substance abuse amelioration programs that looked real sketchy when I just looked at the names of them.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like make-work programs for government fiefdoms, as you would expect in a monopoly service system.
Right.
And I thought that was a little quaint.
Yeah, and the motivation for this, you name it. I think you're probably right. I think it's a lot of it's a jobs program. Ultimately,
Exactly.
is what it comes down to. Like a lot of government programs, and a lot of people are fine with that. I'm not really fine with it because I there's perverse incentives. But when the stated goal, or at least how they're marketing it or selling it, is to reduce the amount of minority arrests. Just because it I don't know. I don't think that's a particularly valid goal, but
I
In
guess if you really wanted to do that, you just set a quota, right?
you sure would.
Oh,
Yeah.
we've hit our limit. I guess we'll have to throw the rest back.
Right. And essentially, like de facto, what has happened, and it's not only in Portland anyway, and probably Oregon in general. They essentially have quotas not on racial basis, but just any crime. There's
Right.
only a certain amount of crime is allowed to be dealt with and prosecuted, and then it renders the police force, whatever you think of them, but it essentially renders them toothless. And so crime, and petty crime in particular, runs rampant. And it's the petty crime that is kind of festered in Portland and other places in Oregon. Some violent crime. I mean, we had the Summer of Love there. The Antifa people. No criminals they, but would destroy buildings and vehicles and assault people. That wasn't necessarily drug related. This was the whole political fallout from the whole COVID nonsense. But I guess in Portugal, so it's an interesting thing. And in Oregon, there was I don't know if they've gone yet, but there was a 20 or so person junket scheduled to go to Portugal to do a little feet on the ground research on how Portugal really does it. This is 3 years after they passed this law. You think they might have done their feet on the ground research with years before, but they're like, I can't figure out why it's not working. But
they didn't want a taxpayer funded a vacation 3 years ago. They wanted one now.
Yeah, they do. And that's exactly what it amounts to. But in Portugal, I think the fallout, I want to say, I can't remember we'll find it here real quick, but Portugal's a relatively small country, and I want to say, let's see, they had one of the highest rates of HIV among intravenous drug users in the entire European Union. And I want to say Portugal's around 1 million people. Anyway, I can't find the information right now.
Well, let's leave Portugal out of this. I mean,
okay.
That's all the way over there in Europe. I'm not even sure that place exists. We got enough to talk about with Oregon. And there's a whole lot wrong with this law and the change they just made. I'd like to first start out by acknowledging that they didn't really make drugs legal, right? They just slightly changed what they were going to call, they changed the structure of the enforcement and the penalties. For small amounts, now you only get a minor infraction. I assume they're going to follow the Portugal model and try and direct you towards some sort of a treatment program.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Minor suggestion. But above that recreational amount, whatever it is, that's still illegal. And of course, that means that the production and distribution of these drugs is necessarily illegal. So it's not the case that the government came along and just decided we're not going to be involved in the drug issue. They're just changing the way they're doing it. And of course, from a libertarian perspective, drug use is not a matter for the state to be involved in because it's none of their damn business. What a person does or does not ingest is only up to that person. And if someone else came along and tried to use force to throw them in a cage because they put some substance in their own body, that would be invalid. So that's just an error. The government shouldn't be involved. And when they are involved, it's a violation of the non-aggression principle. But of course, it gets much, much worse because, and the reason I bring that up is because most people who use drugs don't ever cause any harm to anybody else. In the American mind, we've just automatically associated drug use with all the other stuff that are aggressions. Stealing, violence, running around the street, accosting people, sleeping on the sidewalks, defecating there, throwing your dirty needles in in the public sidewalk to be a hazard for other people. We associate that with drug use, but it's not axiomatic that the one follows the other. Lots of people are fully functional in their normal day-to-day lives, having families and jobs, doing drugs. The correlation isn't one-to-one. But what's so gross about Oregon and a lot of these Democrat-led jurisdictions is that they get themselves involved in prosecuting drug crimes to a high degree or a low one, but then they completely ignore all the actual problems that ostensibly are caused from drug use, like the thieving up to $950 in California, apparently, and abusing the commons, the public streets, by pitching a tent and just living there.
Yeah, and then you say the threshold for getting arrested on the amount of or the value of the amount of goods that you steal. They won't even do anything, and that's a lot of these people might not even be doing drugs. But the perverse incentive is that, like, oh, it's okay because the drug dealers or the drug users need their money, so the only way they can get their money is by stealing. But then the people game the system and just go in there with bags and just take stuff, and that's what's happening. And
with no pushback, no penalty,
none whatsoever.
So we've used this word before, anarcho-tyranny, and this is just another example of it. The police are involved, plenty, but they're not involved in protecting the citizenry from the negative consequences of these people that are either homeless because they're on drugs or just because they prefer it as a lifestyle. And therefore, you as a citizen pay your taxes, and when you find some homeless guy just living outside of your home and business, down Main Street, you call the cops and they don't do anything. Or if they do something, it's to roust the people but not solve the problem. So they'll just move their tent, a couple blocks over, and you haven't done anything to solve the problem. And even worse, since government ostensibly is responsible for ameliorating the suffering of an unequal distribution of wealth, feeding the poor, taking care of the homeless, they're crowding out public efforts to solve this problem in some way, both by taxation and by propaganda and by actually making it illegal for private actors in certain ways to help people. I mean, you've all read the stories about somebody trying to feed the homeless or house the homeless and running afoul of various regulations and zoning laws and whatnot.
Yeah, health code, food safety stuff. It's
just horrible. Yeah. So there's a whole lot wrong with what's going on here. So I mean, this is your hometown. What do you think? I mean, have you gone and looked around? The video footage of this homeless problem and this drug use problem, it looks awful.
Yeah, and there's a couple ways to look at it, really. There was always pockets. Downtown Portland, a little bit before I was growing up, was a pretty rough place. I mean, there was, Portland just in general. It was kind of a vice type city, weirdly enough. Just a lot of weird underground stuff, and it kind of got cleaned up in the 80s, 90s. It was pretty in downtown Portland. It was just kind of like a sterile but nice place to go. And really in the last 3 years, that's changed quite a bit. But the thing is, like, there's always been pockets of places that are really bad. But what's happened over the last, really fast forwarded in the last 3 years, but really over the last probably 20 years, that the places that aren't real nice have got real bad. And the places that were like kind of teetering on the edge of being, okay, this might be nice or might not be, they've been destroyed. And the only place, but the counterpoint to that is that there's some places in the city of Portland that are a lot nicer than they were 3 or 4 years ago because of a lot of money put in new infrastructure projects that are brand new, but that had been planned out for 10 years. So people like if you just want to avoid the riffraff and the crime and stuff, you just kind of move your activity over to these nicer areas. And I think we were talking about it last week off air, but it's like I talk about it. It's like a third world. Parts of it look like a third world hellscape. And a few years ago, when I was driving through downtown and inner southeast Portland, it was like I just couldn't believe it. Like my breath was literally taken away at just like the amount of people just camping on sidewalks, tents. I mean, people had couches, TVs, like it was insane. Like living rooms just right on in parking spot. Meanwhile, there's meter maids that will give you a ticket for violating the time your car spent in this particular spot, but nothing to do with the people.
No one's above the law.
No one is above the law. But the thing is like in a third world country, there are nice places. There are really nice places. Sometimes there's nicer places than we have in the first world. It's just the rest of it is people are living in abject poverty and squalor. And I have a feeling that's what's happening in not only Portland, but a lot of the major cities throughout the United States.
Yeah, it's just a fact of our democratic system that the rich people who vote for these policies live in areas that aren't really affected by them. But the citizenry that, is poor and has to live where these homeless encampments are allowed, they just suffer. They pay their taxes and they just suffer. My anarchist heart just wants to abolish the tragedy of the commons by abolishing the commons. This should all be private property. And if it was, the owners, however that was structured, would set the rules for what behavior is allowed there. And I'm fairly certain that pitching a tent and living and defecating in streets populated by businesses and homes wouldn't be allowed by the homeowners or the property owners in that case. But since I can't wave my magic wand, we have to deal with public property. And we have a monopolized law enforcement agency that's supposed to, take care of the situation. So how do we decide what's allowed on public sidewalks?
I guess briefly, just explain quickly what the tragedy of the commons
it's
is,
from
because some people might not know the theory behind that.
It's back from feudal societies in England, I guess. The way a typical fiefdom would be set up, the lord would own most of the property, but there would be an area called the commons that was quote unquote owned by nobody. And human nature being what it is and economics being what it is, the area that was owned by nobody would be abused by everybody. So, nobody would be maintaining the soil quality and, pulling the weeds. It just means when private property isn't employed, a resource will get overused and undercultivated. You see it in oceans now with fishing.
Sure.
If nobody owns a resource, it's going to be completely mismanaged due to greed and the lack of good incentives and the creation of perverse incentives. That's what that phrase is designed to convey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see it. It's like you have public parks, which are nice or can be nice, but when you have urban camping, they turn into like not a nice place to be, or it's a total authoritarian system where it becomes violence on the part of the police and the part of the state to eliminate these people, I don't know, however they see fit. And then that leaves it up to the individual policemen, and they have their own incentives and whatever. So, but their employer essentially is the state there. So we have a couple things going on here. We have really a problem of the tragedy of the commons, where these people are public streets, public roads, so-called.
Well, just because a thing is called public shouldn't mean in a civilized society that anything goes there, that there are no rules.
Right.
This
But
situation doesn't
that's the
scale.
tragedy, right? That's the tragedy.
If we all
that you're
decided to
talking
pitch a
about.
tent on the public street, well, then it's no longer a street. It's turned into something else.
Yeah, but I can't go and pitch a tent. If I just went down and pitched a tent, I'd probably, anybody. But it's like, all right, well, we know who these people are, and they're, you got to treat them with kid gloves. But if we just all kind of went down and had a camping party at a public park, they'd do something to us. Probably, they wouldn't just let. Maybe not.
Interesting social experiment. I'm not sure what they would
I don't
do.
want to do that. I don't want to be around that at all. And I'm sure most generally civilized people don't want that. So they just leave it up. Maybe it's just they leave it up to the enforcement arm.
The point I'm making is the enforcement arm isn't doing its job. If we are going to operate under the theory that there is such a thing as a public property, well, that public property should have rules. And ideally, they would mirror the rules we would imagine that private property owners would employ if they did, in fact, own the property. Like the people who own homes on a street and the people who own businesses on the street and the people who drive and walk on that street in the normal course of business, they would like that the rules associated with that thoroughfare a certain way. Mm-hmm. Those are different than the rules that would be set by people who like to do a lot of drugs and pitch a tent and just live there and treat it like their own personal bedroom and their own personal toilet. Mm-hmm. Those two rules can't exist in the same, they can't coexist. Mm-hmm. You have to have one or the other. So what are the rules going to be? And I submit that these left-leaning Democrat-run cities need to get their heads out of their rear ends and set and enforce rules that would be the rules set by responsible property owners. If you're going to have public property, you need to maintain it and enforce laws on it in a responsible manner, and they're just not. And to go back to my earlier point, the government does intrude in areas where it has no business, telling you what to put in your own body. That's your choice. But it is the government's business to keep people from aggressing against other people. And they're just falling asleep on the job on that. They're allowing this lawless behavior and just hoping that the public will just put up with it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there, though. You have the policy, the policy, whether it's the state, county, city, federal, whatever it might be, and the police officers themselves. Now, what's happened in a lot of these cities is that the police officers, because of the policy that they're not allowed to either arrest these people, they just have to kind of manage people, or if they do arrest some of these people on these violations, and it's usually the crime part outside of the drugs now, right? So it's the assault, theft, you name it, whatever. So just maybe we could stipulate that that's what they're going after. I don't necessarily buy it, but let's just stipulate that it's the case. The DAs, like you're saying, in these Democrat-run cities and counties, the DAs aren't prosecuting these people on legitimate crimes because their policy and their idea is that we can't have these numbers, because then, going back to a previous episode we did, the equity of these people is somehow violated or misstated or something like that. And so the police officers, they can't do anything. And then it becomes kind of lawless. And then they're at risk of their own life by going into some of these camps or dealing with individuals that might have, who knows, weapons or needles or, anything like that could literally kill them immediately. And granted that a police officer, generally speaking, is one of these fellows who think that's their job. But when you have no backup, when you put all these people in jail for legitimate crimes and they just get out the next day or a few days later, or don't even maybe actually get into a cell, they just are booked and then they're out of there. Well, what's the incentive for the police, an individual police officer, to keep on doing his job? A lot of these police forces are dwindling. So it creates a whole nother problem.
for good reason.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the rise in the homeless problem
Mm-hmm.
over the last few decades. People on the left will just say it's a problem of the inequity and inequality that's inherent in anything approaching a free market or capitalism,
Right.
which we don't have, of course. We don't have anything like a free market. People on the right will say it's something else. It's a drug problem. It's a mental illness problem. It's something else. And I think, all of those things have to do with it a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, but I think mostly it's an incentives problem. There's
Mm-hmm.
not enough friction built into the system
Mm-hmm.
so that people can just, as we see every day when we walk into these homeless encampments, people just are living this life because they choose to. It's just a lifestyle choice. I like being out and with my friends and panhandling and camping and doing a whole bunch of drugs, and there's a whole bunch of treatment options, if things ever get rough, and I can abuse public property and the private homes and businesses that abut it,
Mm-hmm.
and absolutely nothing happens to me.
Mm-hmm.
And if you allow this negative behavior, and I'm qualifying it, I say this is negative. If you allow it, if you put no friction into the system, you're going to get more of it. You're incentivizing it.
Yeah. I was in the teeth of it, really. Not to get too far into it, but I was dealing with people kind of right on the verge, if not coming out of homelessness or just teetering on the edge of it for a few years in what I was doing. And we had a nonprofit, but problem is that the nonprofits are fine. I guess I have my qualms with calling anything in business a nonprofit, but it's tax related and all that stuff. So, take it for what it's worth. But when you start getting involved in this problem, the homelessness, the lack of food, the all these societal problems that are just, if not fully related, tangentially related to homelessness, the state steps in and becomes an arbiter on who gets what and who gets the funds, who's allowed to operate in this space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not private charity just in general is not really allowed. That private
It's crowded out
free
and made
market
illegal.
of
That's right.
charity is crowded out.
That's right.
And so what we've done is like we had to pass all our everything through some bureaucrat at the county, even though people were donating their money for their charity and or tax write-offs directly to us. What was happening is that we had to go vet all these people through some county list. And then the county or state or who knows, I mean, some bureaucratic mechanism has created all these other nonprofits that they're ostensibly private, but they are almost exclusively funded by what amounts to taxpayer money. And so it's just this giant circle that's just washing these people through the system. And like you said, there's no friction. There's no, for some people, yes, but for the large majority of it, it's like, I'm trying to get by. All right. So here, give me my stuff so I can live for a few more days, a few more weeks, another year. And then we'll see where we're at. And then I'm probably going to be in the same spot that I was. And now since you already used the benefits we provided, sorry, you can't have them anymore because you already used them one time.
So the government just poisons everything it touches. It crowds out in the mechanisms we've already discussed, private charity. And of course, it's the most inefficient way to deliver compassionate resources that you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
What are the numbers? The bureaucracy soaks up 70, 80, 90% of all the money that goes towards these programs because they're jobs programs for government bureaucrats who love to feather their own nests and expand their own operation. And whatever crumbs get dribbled down to the actual poor people who are in need. It's just a sliver. So I have a modest proposal for how society should be structured to solve these problems. If you'd care to hear it, Brian.
I would love to hear it.
Well, first, get the government out of the drug business altogether. It's none of their concern. It becomes their concern when one person actually aggresses against another person's body or property, or abuses the public space, since we have it. Second, it has to enforce laws against people doing that horrible behavior that we associate with drugs and homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to pitch a tent and live on the sidewalk. You have to go, because you're violating the rights of the other citizenry. And if we crowd out these government quote-unquote solutions and force these people away from where they'd like to be, which is the sidewalk, and push them somewhere, I don't know, out into the hinterlands or something, or invite them into the backyards of rich liberals who like to vote for horrible policies, we can do that.
Yeah.
The point being, as a human being in society, you're not allowed to just live in the commons. You have to live on private property, either your own or at the invitation of somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And if we got rid of all these taxes and all these government programs, since we are not hard-hearted, insane people, since we actually do care for human suffering and want to reduce it, you would get an enormous outpouring of charitable giving. You already do, even with the crowding out effect.
Yeah, you do.
That would only be multiplied by 10 or 100-fold, even if it were not the case. And so where would that money go? I say it would go to organizations that would create their own on their own property places for these people to live, who either through drugs or mental illness or whatever their problem is, they don't have a home and they can't find one. But they're not allowed to live on Main Street. They're allowed to live at invitation at these other properties, and these can be as nice or as harsh as the owners
have
or
that now a little bit with a lot
it's
of
crowded out,
well,
and
totally
it's made illegal. It's made illegal. I mean,
but you do kind of have
Kanye
that
West try to build a whole bunch of homes for the homeless, and the LA County just made them destroy them.
Right. Yeah. So you can only get these people in the government built housing that they provide, and then like you said, the crowding out. There's only a certain amount of people allowed in any one of these buildings, and then they're not allowed to get kicked out really, unless they have to do something real bad, like maybe murder or something. And even, these days, who knows if that's even going to get prosecuted. But so they build these nice, new construction stuff. And I noticed this in Portland, Oregon, particularly when I was driving a taxi cab. You pick up these people at these places and, they're just trying to get by. But, there's like warlords inside these buildings. Essentially,
of course, like prisons.
Yeah, they're like prisons. Essentially, is what it amounts to, and the destruction on the inside. They won't do any improvements because they already spent their money that they had allotted to this thing, and they have to keep it just.
Well, if these things were private, first of all, there'd be competition to run good ones, which you don't get in any government's situation at all, and the incentives would be properly aligned. You're not allowed, as a drug-addled, crazy homeless person, to be out on Main Street. So the cops will take you somewhere where you are invited to be, one of these charitable places. And the purpose there, I would assume, if I were on the board, would be to help these people get their life together.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't have the perverse incentives of being a drug-addicted, crazy person in a tent on Main Street. That's not such a bad life.
Yeah.
Instead, since you're not allowed to do that, you will be motivated to go to one of these other places where they're trying to help you get your life together, get you off drugs, give you some skills to actually be a productive member of society. And when incentives are aligned in the right way, you get better behavior. You get better societies. You sure as hell get better public streets.
Right. And what you have now essentially is enabling of the bad behavior because,
the bad behavior of both drug-addicted homeless and government bureaucrats. And I'm not sure which is worse, honestly.
Well, yeah. And the enabling behavior, it's like, and then people realize that, well, their incentive now is like, I can just keep on doing the same thing and nothing's going to touch me. And I got, like you said, the only thing I got to live for is hanging out.
And it's tragic. These people just drip their lives away. There's no incentive for them really to fix anything. Their behavior is subsidized, and the harm they're causing to their fellow man is tolerated.
Mm-hmm.
It's tragic for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe a minute or two more here, but I was a firm believer for a long time in the drug war, but I didn't really know what that was. I was like, oh, a drug war? Yeah. Okay. We're just going to get rid of drugs and have
How's that working out?
Have the societal degradation that taken care of. Yeah, it's fine. Well, that started in early 70s. And I think by 2008 or 9, I remember Pat Buchanan, who was in the Nixon administration when this whole thing kind of started, he kind of came down on the side because, Buchanan was aligned with a lot of the our type of libertarians in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways. And so he had to kind of came to it and want to call him. I remember, like I said, I want to say it's 2008 or 2009, probably around a presidential cycle or something. But he said something to the effect, it's either Mao or Milton, referring to
That's right.
Mao Zedong's philosophy in China of imprisoning and or giving capital punishment to all drug users and drug dealers, which is one way to handle it. And then Milton Friedman, a libertarian, probably not in our realm, but a libertarian nonetheless. Milton Friedman says it just kind of like you do, like it should all be legalized. And he's like, well, I think the drug war, because it was prosecuted poorly, the core, like from the top, what you said at the top, the core issue is not the drugs.
Right.
The core issue is the violence and the crime. And so what we have done is gone off after all these narco terrorists and trying to get the source of the cocoa leaf and whatever in Colombia and spending millions and trillions of dollars trying to fight this and, like playing whack-a-mole with all the drug dealers downtown in any given town. And what happens is like they don't do anything or do enough anyway about the crime.
Well,
so if you just say that the drug dealing is not the crime,
but they make it worse.
That's a transaction, right? That's a transaction on a black or gray market.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about social degradation, and I agree. Heavy drug use does, at least on the margin and maybe a thick margin, I think it does degrade a society, but drug prohibition degrades it much, much, much more.
You get the Al Capones.
It corrupts the police. You get the Al Capones. You get the black markets. You get bribery. You get corruption. And you get people no longer wanting to have anything to do with the police because what they're doing in a peaceful way is criminal now.
Mm-hmm.
Me using drugs, me buying drugs, me selling drugs, that doesn't hurt anybody. So you get these horrible, perverse incentives. And if you were worried about violence, well, look at all the bullets that went flying when alcohol was prohibited.
Right.
You think prohibition makes violence reduce? No. It multiplies it.
Mm-hmm.
So social degradation, if you're a conservative and you want a vibrant, healthy society, don't do things to poison your own moral fiber by eliminating substances, by prohibiting substances used by peaceful people.
Yeah, I mean, what Ron Paul famously said in one of his campaigns is that it threw a lot of people off. He's like, yeah, heroin should be legal. He's like, I'm never going to do heroin, you crazy person. Like, but and
it's a whole room of people for whom it was South Carolina. I think he said
something like that. Yeah.
And he said, if it was legalized tomorrow, would any of you use it?
Right.
And of course, nobody would. But in their minds, they think, oh, my God, everyone would be using heroin. That's insane.
Yeah.
And the only thing that would make that happen more on the margins is if we allow the negative side effects, like letting people sleep on the sidewalk.
Sure.
Like that's not a problem.
Yeah.
Put friction in the system in intelligent ways, and you will get better behavior.
I agree. it's a good way to wrap up. And the problem is, I think we don't have a whole lot of intelligent people as our guardians of society in positions of power. They only exist on podcasts. But we encourage the folks out there to either join Adam's Libertarian Party, which he's in membership, or you get, well, shall we say, hash these ideas around with fellows and ladies of like-mindedness in the Tomwood School of Life, which we'll have a link for that in our show notes. That's how Adam and I got connected originally, thanks to the great Tom Woods. Any last words, Adam?
I think that's it, Brian. Okay. Thank you for listening, and always good to talk to you.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks. Bye. For more, head on over to naturalorderpodcast.com. Show notes for today's episode can be found at naturalorderpodcast.com/ep15. That's naturalorderpodcast.com/EP15.